This is AM Agenda. With me now, Liberal MP Steve Ciobo and Labor MP Michelle Rowland. Michelle Rowland, first to you. You've heard what Scott Morrison had to say. The government's been too weak when it comes to groups of asylum seekers that threaten self-harm, that support should have been sent to that merchant vessel last week, which rendered assistance to the group south of Java. What do you say to that? Should the government toughen up its response when it comes to these circumstances where we see asylum seekers make threats of self-harm?
Well, I thought that was quite an extraordinary tirade from Scott Morrison. In particular, I want to take point with him trying to wriggle out of the fact that he's got one position and his foreign affairs spokesperson has another position, because he was out there advocating unilateral action, those actual word, that actual phrase unilaterally, and then we have Julie Bishop saying no, we would never act unilaterally. And I found it very interesting, Kieran, that when you put the question to him several times, well, what would you do in this situation if you're in government? He was actually incapable of answering it and just came back to slogans. And I think it just shows that the opposition's quite clearly rattled at this point in time. I mean, they've had a policy which is essentially a series of slogans for the last 3 years. They didn't actually expect the government to have survived the 43rd Parliament. And even when it comes to the slightest puff of wind to question what their policy is, they can't actually articulate what it is.
But he does point to what worked under the Howard government and what the coalition government has done before. Isn't that a decent argument to say, look at our record, look at our track record, this is what we've done before and we'll do it again?
Totally different set of circumstances, Kieran, totally different. What worked in the past, or the situation in the past in terms of global events that led to people getting on boats back then, is very different to what it is now. And anyone who suggests otherwise is kidding themselves. And I would also point out that Prime Minister Rudd, in the joint communique that was released with the Indonesian government, very strongly emphasised the need for a regional approach to this issue. And this is the one point that the opposition steadfastly fails to support. They aligned with the Greens Party in the last Parliament to make sure that that didn't go ahead. They still are against it today and are just pushing slogans as they always have.
Steve Ciobo, is it too much to liken the episode that we've seen reported in the Australian today, an episode last week at sea, that Scott Morrison has likened that to the Tampa and the handling of it by the Howard government? Or should the government have considered deploying the SAS, the military, to board that boat?
Well, Kieran, I think that what Scott made clear was the Tampa in reverse. And you know, I listened to Michelle's answer, and honestly, I don't know what planet the Labor Party is on, because clearly it is not planet Earth, Kieran. I mean, you know, it's a very straightforward proposition, this one. The coalition had a solution. We had in place a policy that saw temporary protection visas, turned back the boats where it was safe to do so, and had offshore processing. It was a very straightforward policy. Labor then went in. They changed the border protection laws under Kevin Rudd. I mean, this was Kevin Rudd who made these changes. Since then, 745 boats, over 44,000 people. And Labor says, oh no, the world's all different today. It's all because of external factors. It's got nothing to do with our policy. I mean, Australians aren't stupid.
But what about
Kieran.
Deploying the military, Steve Ciobo? Your thoughts on
Look, I
that?
I think frankly that John Howard showed strength of character, and he showed that Australians determine what happens on our side of the border and no one else. Now, we are committed to regional processing, but make no mistake, when it comes to border protection, the only nation that's best placed to make decisions about what happens on our side of the border is the Australian government, and we need strength of leadership. We don't need someone like Kevin Rudd, who made our borders porous and has seen an influx of 45,000 people.
Let's hear Alexander Downer last night. He was on Sky News.
We, of course, didn't ask the Indonesians for permission because we knew they wouldn't give permission to do this, because the Indonesians have always said this is Australia's problem, not our problem. And I've always said, well, if it's our problem, we are going to deal with it in our way and we're going to do it effectively.
That's from one of the senior members of the Howard government there, Michelle Rowland, saying that the government has to, and that this nation's got to take decisions which are in our interest as a sovereign nation, not necessarily what the Indonesians want.
Well, yeah, Steve asked me what planet I live on. I live on the planet which recognises that we are in 2013. We are not in the same position that Alexander Downer and co were in back then. And if they want to bring up the ghost of Alexander Downer to support their policies, go ahead, because people will see this exactly for what it is. This is more of a race to the bottom, using slogans, no solutions, just slogans. And if you want to talk about doing things unilaterally, really, do you think that having a confrontation with Indonesia on this issue is really something that we want? Do you think that disagreeing and going ahead unilaterally on these matters is better than cooperation?
Kieran, any day of the week.
This is absolutely absurd to be suggesting.
Steve, I want to go to you just quickly because I've got to move on. The mixed message from Julie Bishop and Scott Morrison, that was they're sending mixed messages at the weekend, aren't they?
No, not a mixed message at all. Our policy is very straightforward. Turn back the boats where it's safe to do so. Temporary protection visas, offshore processing. And you know what? I will match the Howard government and the coalition's track record with Kevin Rudd's track record any day of the week.
Let's go to the Rudd advertisement last night. I want to play that for our viewers who haven't seen it.
All Australians are sick and tired of negative politics. I believe people want all of us to raise the standards. What I care about is whether your kids are getting better schools, whether people in city and country have the same access to fast broadband, whether your local hospital has a decent emergency department, whether you have a strong economy and job security, and for both sides of politics to have a positive plan for our country's future.
Kevin Rudd saying he wants to lift the standard, Steve Ciobo. Is the Liberal Party doing enough to counter Rudd Mark II as he seeks to define his leadership?
Kieran, everyone knows and they've seen Tony Abbott hold up our plan for re-election. We've got positive plans and have had them out there for some time. And look, I think Australians recognise advertising for what it is. I mean, Kevin Rudd has spent 3 years pulling the rug out from underneath Julia Gillard. He stuck the knife in 2 weeks ago and defeated her in a bloody leadership coup. And then he goes out there and he says, hey guys, I'm all fresh and new. I've just been washed white again. And this is all about a positive future. Oh, and by the way, what I really care about is making sure we've got good hospitals. I mean, Australians would remember back in 2007, Kieran, when Kevin Rudd was all about brand spanking new hospitals. And here we are 6 years later, and what's happened? The legacy of Kevin Rudd as leader was death, was debt, and was deficits. And now he claims that all of a sudden he's a new man with a new plan and a positive agenda. I mean, Australians know not to take this guy seriously.
Okay, Michelle Rowland, is it a bit rich to be trying to say it's a new Kevin Rudd, a new Labor 6 years on?
I think Steve's answer just shows how rattled he is and how Kevin Rudd is absolutely on the money with what Australians want in terms of our political delivery. People are sick of the negativity. They tell me this as I go out in my community.
You've been very negative this morning, Michelle.
Well, I haven't been negative
very
like
negative.
You, talking
You've
about
been attacking
blood,
us constantly.
talking about blood and stabbing and chalices of blood. You know, these are the people who put out, their ad that they put out is one of Julie Collins, a cabinet minister, making fun of her. Just mean and nasty. Kevin Rudd comes out and talks about three policy areas, two of which, health and education, the Liberals don't even have a policy. The third one, broadband, well, their fraudband policy, which 76% of Australians have rejected.
Doesn't sound
in
too
favour
positive
of
now,
ours,
Michelle.
in favour
You're
of
not sounding too positive now.
Oh,
Michelle Rowland.
really? Well, yeah, I'll take my broadband policy against yours any day, and you don't have policies in the other two areas, so it's a no contest.
I want to ask you about the election date, Michelle Rowland. Some suggestion that Kevin Rudd's considering holding off now to mid-October. Does that look like the government's clinging to power?
Well, it's the prerogative of the Prime Minister of the day to call an election as and when they choose, and that's been the case as long as I can remember. And I wouldn't be so cocky if I was Steve, quite frankly, too, because if you want an election today, happy to go an election right now. You haven't even got policies to back it up. You know, these are the people who thought they'd be in power by now. They were yelling election now for the last 3 years, thought the 43rd Parliament would collapse. It was actually the most efficient Parliament in terms of getting legislation through. They still don't have any policies. They thought they would have been in government. Okay. So I'd be very careful about how cocky I was, Steve.
Steve Ciobo, on the election date, the sky won't fall in, will it, if it's a month earlier or later?
You know, Kieran, if that's Michelle being positive, I'd hate to see Michelle being negative. That's all I can say. Look, in terms of the election date, mate. Look, the election will be when the election is. But what I know is this: at the start of the year, the Labor Party or the temporary Labor leader or whatever Julia Gillard was said the election be on September the 14th. All Australians are working to that date. We've got Australian businesses working to the date of September the 14th. 2 weeks ago, Kevin Rudd in a bloody coup becomes the new Labor leader once again.
Blood,
and now
blood,
all of a sudden he says, oh, we don't have a date, I'll make a date that suits me. You know what? The only people who should make the date and the people who want to have their say are the Australian people, so let's give them the chance to have their say.
Okay, Steve Ciobo and Michelle Rowland, thanks very much for a robust Monday morning discussion. I appreciate it.
Pleasure. Thank you.